Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Hunkered in a Bunker. For some of you, you are brand new students, and I am looking so forward to this very unique semester that we're going to have for sure. Hopefully you read through all the instructions and directions and all that good stuff that you needed to in Canvas, and you're all up to date with the first two PowerPoints called What is Civics Day 1 and What is Civics Day 2. If you're all caught up with that and you have sent me a confirmation email to let me know that you are in here, then let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, the first unit of civics, before we talk about politics, before we talk about government and Trump and the stock market and economy, the first thing we have to do is set up America. I have to show you kind of where we came from and why we set certain things up the way that we set them up. I call these the Legos of America. So before we talk about American history, we got to go way back in time to something called the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was just a movement that sort of ran through Europe where people no longer relied on faith and religion. No longer did we rely on what you believed, your little believies. We didn't care anymore. And you know why? Because 1/3 of Europe just died thanks to something called the Black Plague. I'm sure that none of you know what it's like living in a worldwide pandemic or sickness that's taken over everything and shut everything down, and people have died and people are injured and everything's just kind of not normal like it used to be. After the Black Plague came through and 1/3 of Europe died, basically 1/3 of the world, all of your friends, your family, your co-workers, everybody that you knew in your town died. And you have been a devoted religious person your entire life. You can't read the Bible or anything like that. You're not that educated. But you're devout and you do everything that you're supposed to do. And now all of a sudden you've lost everything. For the first time in your life, and a lot of people's lives, they started looking up and asking why. How can it be that if God is real, all these things can happen? This doesn't make any sense. And for the first time in human evolution, we started using reason and science. We didn't care no longer what you thought about something. Now, you had to prove it to me. And also in the Enlightenment, no longer did we want to give all the power to just kings and queens and princes and princesses and dukes and all these things. None of it made sense to us. Again, reason, logic, science. We're looking at it and we're going, why don't we have qualified people leading? And why don't we vote? Why don't we have the citizens vote for people instead of just giving it to someone because of their blood and their genetics? It makes no sense. So the Enlightenment changed everything in the world. This movement, this idea that humans for the first time are going to question things, and we're going to use reason, and we're going to start studying the human anatomy, and we're going to start studying these ideas of democracy, that people leading a nation like they did in ancient Greece is way better than giving power over to people who don't necessarily qualify or deserve to have it. During the Enlightenment, some of these people that were questioning things, we call them philosophers. They're just people that ask great questions and question why. Some of you are great philosophers. When your parents tell you to do something, you always ask, why? That's a great philosopher and philosophy mentality. And some of the biggest philosophers came out of this time. Take this guy, for example, this handsome devil, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Bet you can't guess what nation he's from. Jean-Jacques. He wrote a book called The Social Contract. And in this book, he said, in order to have a successful society, here's what you need. You need to have an agreement between the leaders and the citizens. And that agreement is sort of like a social contract. It's unwritten. You don't write it. None of you have ever written anything like that to the government, but it's just understood. And here's what it means. I'll follow your laws as long as you protect my rights. I can't think of any scenario where this has been tested like during this COVID pandemic. This idea that we'll agree to follow your laws as long as you make sure you protect my rights. This is 2020 in a nutshell. This is what everybody's arguing about. I'll follow your right to wear a mask and social distance, but at what cost? How long are we doing this? How much more am I going to have to give up? He said you had to have a perfect balance. You had to have an agreement. People are not going to agree to follow your laws if they think that it's infringing upon their rights. We're seeing this right now. So thank you, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Another guy, this handsome devil, John Locke, he wrote a book And in this book, he said two very important ideas. He said that I think people have the right to revolt. So if you have a government that is not protecting your rights, you have the right to overthrow him. And what rights was he talking about? He called them natural rights or divine rights, given to you by God, is what John Locke said. And he said, here's what they are. You are born with life. You have a right to live. He thought you have a right to liberty, which means freedom, that you have a right to be free. And you have a right to property. You have a right to ownership, to have a house, to have land. This is what John Locke said. You have a right to own things, businesses. And without these things, you would not have a successful country. And hopefully, you know by looking at this, this is America. I mean, without John Locke, we would have no United States of America. This is what we founded this country on, 100%. Charles Montesquieu. Charles wrote a book as well, and in his book, he said not only should the people run the country, we should have democracy. He said not only should we have a right to revolt, and he agreed with the idea of natural rights, but he also said this, that the people that we do give power to, the people that we consent to give our power to, even if we do vote, that it should be more than one, that we should have a separation of powers. He says that he thinks we should have at least three branches. We should have an executive or a leader, president, that we should have a legislative, people making our laws, Congress, and we should have a judicial, a court system, judges, right? This would be our Supreme Court. He said these three branches working together would make a perfect country. And in order for these three branches to work together perfectly, they had to be able to check in on each other and make sure that each other are doing what they're supposed to do. And if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do, they have a right to boot them out. That's called a system of checks and balances. This is what Donald Trump has been experiencing his whole entire presidency. He's had people coming after him left and right, and he's been coming after people left and right. The Supreme Court's had to get involved. All three branches are working together to make sure that nobody is getting screwed, nobody is getting accused of something that they did not do, and to make sure that, things are running smoothly and no one's getting away with corruption or illegal activity, right? Voltaire, first of all, let's take a moment and marvel at the hair. Dear God. Voltaire also wrote a book, and Voltaire, to me, I feel like I was Voltaire in a past life, to be honest with you, because his important idea is my important idea. It's my number one thing, free speech. He said this, I might not like what you say, but I will defend your right to say it to the death. I may disapprove of what you say, but you have the right to say it. And I think in 2020, that's the one thing that we may be losing more than anything else. Now, Voltaire actually wrote satirical articles, which is kind of like what we experience today with all these fake news and all these things. He would write hilarious stories and different jokes and different things like that. He lambasted everybody from world leaders to philosophers to the church. I mean, he was cruel in some of his articles. I mean, he was all about free speech. But do you see how America has we're kind of grabbing from these major philosophers, and we're picking and choosing which ideas we think we want to incorporate in the world's greatest nation. So before we look at the Constitution and before we dive down into why we made the country the way we made it, we had to talk about the Enlightenment. And now you know what it is, and we had to look at some philosophers. Well, now let's look at some other documents. Let's look at something called the Magna Carta. And no, I'm not talking about Jay-Z's album. Back in 1215, there was a guy by the name of King John that was leading England, and he was known to be quite the Ellen DeGeneres. I mean, he was treating everybody around him harshly. He even treated his nobles bad. And eventually, they got sick of it. In 1215, they rebelled against him, and they forced him. Now, they didn't ask him. They forced him to sign a document that they called the Magna Carta. And this document is very important for you, even though you don't realize it. Because here's what it did. It removed powers away from this guy. We said, look, man, you are absolutely out of your mind. You are treating people like crap. You have way too much power. It has gone to your head. Give us some of that power back. So we took some of the power back, and we actually protected some people's rights in the Magna Carta. We protected nobles' rights that upheld their ability to have authority so that they would have say-so in the matters and not just King John. And it guaranteed that nobody was above the law, not even the king or the queen themselves. Here's what the document looks like. Very beautiful. Perfect writing. Now, after King John, there was a fellow by the name of King Henry, and King Henry took this to another step. He said, not only am I going to allow this document and give you rights and remove some powers away from me, but I don't want to make decisions by myself. I want to meet with a group of people, and I want them to advise me and help me govern. Eventually, this group got so big that it started including citizens. You didn't just have to be an intellectual or a business owner or a professor or a doctor or a lawyer, or you didn't have to be someone of influence. You could just be a regular citizen if you knew what you were talking about. And by the late 1300s, this group had grown into a full-blown legislature, which is a lawmaking body. By 1688, this parliament group, actually got so powerful it removed the king. It's called the Glorious Revolution. There wasn't any violence or bloodshed or riots or anything like that. They actually just removed him peacefully. It shows you that this group, now including citizens, has become more powerful than the monarch has ever been, ever. 1 year later, this group wrote another document called the English Bill of Rights, and it suspended Parliament's laws, if they needed to be, taxes. It could raise an army without the consent of the king. It also declared that members would be elected, and it guaranteed free speech. So in cases like debating, you would never have to worry about what you say, which is crucial. Again, back to Voltaire. It protected you with a trial by jury, and it banned cruel and unusual punishment, like what they used to do to people who question religion. Here's what it looks like, this wonderful pea soup. It's beautiful. Anybody know what that clock's called? And what this set up was something called common law, which if you have been born in America your entire life and you know law, you know common law. Because it's basically what we have here. It's judges that look back on a previous case to determine what your sentence will be, what your punishment will be. No longer, ladies and gentlemen, will you have to go sit in a creepy room in a dungeon with some random judge. You have no friends, no family, no peers, no lawyer. You don't even have a trial, right? You're not guaranteed anything. You have no rights. You're sit down in there, and your freedom, the rest of your life depends on what this guy says. And this guy could be racist, sexist. He could not like what you think. His political ideologies could be different than you. Everything could be different. He could lock you up forever for nothing. No longer. This is still in effect to this day, folks. We removed cruel and unusual punishment. Now your sentencing has to be based off of something else. This keeps everything checked and balanced. It keeps it fair. Justice, right? Oh, by the way, here's why some people were wanting to come to America. The largest reason is religious persecution. And here's what was happening. Between 1500 and 1700 in England, over 80,000 Protestants, Protestant meaning you're Christian but not Catholic, were tried for being witches. More than 40,000 of them were found guilty and publicly executed. Most of them burning alive. This is my favorite. Look at this wheel of torture. They would put your body on these little hooks and spin you over fire. And all of this could be done just because you said the wrong thing. How about the heretic's fork? The Catholic Church used this in the 12th and 15th century. They would put this fork between your chin and your chest, and you would never be able to rest your head. Savage. How about indulgences? Didn't have to be violent. The church was taking so much money from people that it qualifies as being persecution. You would have to pay to be forgiven. All of these things got people's attention, looking to a different place. And they found a place with endless fields, gorgeous beaches, endless deserts, vast mountain regions. Folks, we're coming to America. Beginnings of America, Part 2. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Everybody remembers that song, right? This started what's known as the European exploration of the Americas. Columbus sailed for Spain, but he landed off some islands off of Central America. He never actually stepped foot in America. People don't know that. As you can see from this map, you can kind of see where most countries landed. Here in the pink is where we are, North Kakalaki, which is why you see a lot of white people, because most of them are from Britain. But you also have a lot of French, Portuguese. As you notice, Spain landed down here in Florida, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Here is the first European settlements. The Spanish were actually here first. They're going to settle the very first place here in America in 1565. So over 200 years before we're going to establish this country, the Spanish are already here building a place called St. Augustine, which is still there to this day. It's the country's oldest city. The French are going to set up in Canada and the Mississippi River. The Dutch, which we all know are very much into fashion, they're going to establish New York. They're going to be really into business. And the English are going to settle on the East Coast. Now, before we talk about the 13 colonies, first you got to know what the word colony means, and this is a heavy definition. The word colony means this, and read it very carefully. It's a country or area under the control of another. It can even be a really, really distant one. Here in America, we set up 13 of these, and can you guess what country controlled them? We had northern colonies, which were mostly port cities, and southern colonies, which were mostly farm cities, and then they would meet in the middle and kind of trade back and forth. These became merchant cities. These are places like even New York City would be considered one of these merchant cities, high in business. All colonies had slaves, not just the South, but the South had way more because they had way more farms. Now, the very first permanent English settlement, not first permanent settlement period, because that's Spain, but the first English settlement is called Jamestown. This is where the first slaves were brought in. This is where they grew tobacco. They realized that they could grow tobacco and use it to make lots of money, so it was called a cash crop. That was their number one. And they set up a house of burgesses, or as I like to call it, burgesses, which is basically like a Congress. I mean, it's basically like the first building where they would go kind of discuss issues, which was a huge idea, by the way, because keep in mind, do you think the king would enjoy the fact that we are making decisions on our own? No, not to spoil it. Here's what Jamestown looks like. You can still go to this day. Most of it's been preserved. Now, there's another colony, not just Jamestown. There's several. And another one that we're going to talk about is called Plymouth Colony. Now, the reason Plymouth is important is because Plymouth is founded by religious separatists known as Pilgrims. They sailed over here on a very famous ship called the Mayflower, and they wrote something called the Mayflower Compact, which is basically like them having a conversation on the boat saying this: what happens if someone murders someone? Do we lock them up? Do we kill them? Do we let them go? And the other person probably said, I don't know. It's up to the king. Well, here's the problem. How long do you think it would take to get a letter to the king asking him about, what do we do about this murderer? It could be years, assuming he ever gets it. So don't you think we need to start making some decisions on our own, even though the king is not going to like it? So they did. They wrote something called the Mayflower Compact, and they signed it. And they said, listen, some things we might have to vote on. It might be a majority rule. We can't ask the king for everything. We're going to have to make some decisions on our own. That, ladies and gentlemen, is in a nutshell the Mayflower Compact. Here's what the Virginia House of Burgesses looks like. It's beautiful. It's the very first version of self-government in this country, which, as you know, the king will not be happy about. Fast forward to America becoming a successful country. Not only a successful country, one of the most successful and talked about countries in the world. American citizens, these American colonists, enjoyed the freedom that they've had for all these years. They enjoy being 3,000 miles away from mom and dad. Just like you do when your parents leave. You enjoy that feeling of being left alone, left to your own devices. They were experimenting with self-government, making decisions by themselves. It was wonderful. It's like when kids go to college for the first time. But however, the king started noticing something around the mid-1700s, and he started tightening up his grip on the colonist because he noticed they were making a lot of, and he wanted some of that. It's an idea called mercantilism, and it's this idea that a country should sell more goods than it buys. So here's what they were trying to do. They were trying to squeeze as much money out of the colonists as they possibly can by requiring them to do certain things like this: buy their raw materials at low prices from them. England was forcing them to buy stuff from them at very low prices. They couldn't sell their own stuff to other countries. England was trying to dictate how much money the colonies can make by basically skimming a lot off the top. Obviously, the colonists were not happy about this, folks. And they started boycotting British goods. They started refusing to buy Britain stuff. And Britain did not respond to this well either. They started passing acts like crazy. They started acting up, if you will. They passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which said that England had the right to make decisions for the colonists. They passed the Townshend Acts, which basically charged higher taxes on all the goods that they imported into the country. The colonists couldn't get glass and tea and paper and lead. All these materials were hard for them to make in their own country, so they had to buy it from England. Well, England knew this, and they sat back like a savage, and they said, let's make these things more expensive because they have to have them, so they're going to buy them. So let's make as much money as we can and make them mad. Then they passed the Tea Act. Everybody drank tea. They still do in the South, which gave Britain companies an advantage over other companies. They made you buy their tea at whatever price they charged you. Americans do not take this lightly. And in response, we do what America does best. When we get mad and angry, we get petty. And that's exactly what we did. In Boston, we dumped 342 chests of tea, not liquid tea, tea leaves, into the Boston Harbor, which is millions of dollars, folks, in today's money. This made Britain so mad. Got to keep in mind, Britain's the number one country on the planet. They win every war they get involved in. They have the number one army and navy in the world. This is what they do, and they're getting bested by this little group 3,000 miles away. They can't handle it. So they passed something called the Intolerable Acts, which basically restricted your rights even more than they were already restricted. Now, when you're walking down the road, you're getting searched. Your property's getting seized, and there's nothing you can do about it. Here's some artifacts from the actual era of the Tea Party, as you see here. Here's one of the actual chests from the Tea Party. It's one of the only few that survived, but you can still see this in Boston today. Here is some actual tea leaves that survived. Someone scooped them up. And here is where this event took place, folks, at the Boston Harbor. If you ever go to Boston, make sure you stop by there and check it out. Very famous event. So in response to all these acts, in response to England threatening us, basically, which is what they're doing, we had a meeting. We sent some of the most smartest representatives in this country to represent each state to one place in Philadelphia. And they had to talk about, what are we going to do? We cannot take this lightly, folks. In September of 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia. And this thing lasted months. This was not just some quick meeting that lasted 2 hours. This thing drug out for several weeks. When the king finds out that we're meeting, that we're potentially thinking about breaking up with him and trying to figure out how to handle this, he responds with violence right away. And in Lexington and Concord, not here in North Carolina, in April of 1775, this is where the official Revolutionary War starts, folks. And after this, it's not hard for us to make a decision. In May, we meet again, these same people in the same place. It's called the Second Continental Congress. And they spend months debating each little detail. But at the end, in 1776, more than half the delegates agreed. We must do something. We must. A guy by the name of Thomas Paine stood up and said, you don't have to be the smartest person in this room to know that something has to be done about this. You could just use your common sense. And matter of fact, he wrote a book called Common Sense, where he argued this is the right thing to do. So, we broke up. We wrote the world's greatest breakup letter, folks. And if you ever break up with someone, don't tell them that you're breaking up with them and you want to be single. Tell them you're declaring yourself independent. Congress wrote a breakup letter, and it is the most petty letter you've ever read in your entire life. I encourage you all to read it. I'm going to include a little assignment where you have to break down some of the lines on here as one of your assignments this week. But it is hilarious to read once you know what you're reading. So here we go. By the way, Thomas Jefferson did almost all the work, just like when y'all get in group work. In the Declaration, they explained why. Can you imagine writing a breakup letter and you having an introduction? They said England didn't look after our interests. They called him a tyrant and an unfit ruler. Can you imagine if someone broke up with you and called you unfit and a tyrant? They also said this, the government's not looking after our rights, and that's the one thing that we think you should be doing as a government. And we should have the right to overthrow you and break up with you if we want to. So we're going to include that in the breakup letter as well. And then they listed things they hated about the king and that they were going to do different. Can you imagine being that petty? Writing in a breakup letter, here's everything I hate about you and here's everything I'm going to do different. It would be a nightmare. On July 4th, 1776, this breakup letter finally gets the approval. So ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The Legos of America kind of bringing us up to speed to where we are. We established this country. I showed you where all the different nations went. We are truly what's called a melting pot. Hopefully you looked at those What is Civics PowerPoints, those two I put in here earlier this week, where it explains citizenship and immigrants and this idea of a melting pot. Today I showed you all the different countries that came over here and kind of where we set up. I showed you Jamestown, which is a very, very important settlement, the very first permanent English settlement. We talked about St. Augustine, which is the oldest city in America. It's the first settlement ever, but not put there by English people, put there by Spanish people. But also keep in mind, there's another group of people here that we haven't talked about that was here in this country before we got here. Can you guess who it is? So we're going to talk about them later on too, because all these people are going to conflict with one another. They have to, right? They're all trying to share the same space. But before we do that, the issue is now. What do? We have officially broken up with England because we didn't like the way they were treating us. We are at war. We have just signed a breakup letter. Britain is absolutely coming at us with all full force. We are in the middle of a war. So what are we going to do? How are we going to set up this new government? How are we going to take the ideas of these philosophers that we've just talked about, the Montesquieu's, the John Locke's, all these guys? How are we going to take those ideas and incorporate them into our new country? And how are we going to set up a system where it doesn't get as corrupt as systems we were coming from last? Well, folks, stay tuned because that's what's going to be in the new unit. I hope that all of you have enjoyed this PowerPoint. I hope you printed out the note sheets and fill them out. I hope you're all staying on top of your assignments. If you have any questions, please email me. Don't wait till the day the assignment's due, because if you do that, then you have no time to fix it, and I might not see it till later. So make sure you stay on top of everything and email me. I love you all. If you have any questions, holler at me. Make sure you get those assignments tuned in, and I will see you next time. Peace.